Hi, good morning, everyone. My name's Piers Turner. I'm the co-director of the Center for Ethics and Human Values, and I just want to welcome you to the first panel of our COMPAS Conference on the Future of Work. COMPAS stands for Conversations on Morality, Politics, and Society. And the main idea here is to bring together scholars from different disciplines or perspectives, each of whom is grappling with some part of a large underlying ethical or social issue. Our view is that to solve the complex ethical and social problems we face, we need a variety of perspectives. So I'm pleased that today we're bringing together in our panels leading researchers from philosophy, comparative studies, economics, and sociology to help us think about the future of work, where there's really great people in all of these fields thinking about this. Especially in these really rapidly changing times, both technologically and socially. Let me just say a word about the fact that this is put on by the Center for Ethics and Human Values. If you don't know who we are, please check us out at cehv.osu.edu. We run many programs on campus supporting reflection and discussion on ethical issues, where we're trying to promote the value of constructive discussion across differences and disciplines. And we'd love to hear from you if you have thoughts about the kind of work that we could do, or if you're interested in engaging us on one of the programs we're already doing. So with that, I'm just going to pass things over to my wonderful colleague, Greg Heitzusen, who's Associate Professor of Professional Practice in the School of Environment and Natural Resources. A lot of his own work is on the role of sort of religious values in thinking about environmental questions. And he's going to get us started with the first panel. Thanks, Greg.
Good morning. Well, I want to thank Piers for introducing this, and just want to say I'm always pleased to be a part of the Center for Ethics and Human Values for bringing the kinds of conversations to the university that I think we certainly need more of in these days. And I will just say that maybe I think it was a little bit fortuitous that I was invited to moderate this panel this morning, because I'm kind of having that kind of semester or that kind of week, or maybe it's my work ethic, or maybe it's just the overload, that I think I'm sort of at risk of maybe, overworking myself a little bit. Does anybody relate to this feeling? Maybe even tending towards burnout just a little bit. And you get to the point where maybe I need a sabbatical. It's about what I'm thinking about, which my position is like the equivalent of the clinical position, the professional practice professorship. And guess what's not available to professional practice professors in our college? It's sabbaticals. Anyway, so that's not religious accommodation, but religiously derived accommodation. Fortunately, we have a thing called special assignment leave, which I am headed for in the fall. But I wonder sometimes whether am I tending too close just by virtue of the things I've been rewarded for about the way I work on things. Are they putting me on this edge of burnout, if you will, or am I headed for a good night where I fall asleep in my bed completely exhausted from a hard day's work, and I'll sleep well, feeling a sense of achievement for having done so? Where is that line for me? I sort of wonder. So like I say, maybe it's a little fortuitous. I'm hoping that our speakers today might give me a little bit more to think about, and particularly during my leave time this fall, about some of these topics. But it's my pleasure to introduce, just a brief introduction of our speakers. First, we're going to have Andrea Veltman, who is a professor of philosophy at James Madison University, and most importantly, she's the author of the Oxford University Press book from 2016, Meaningful Work. And Andrea is going to look at some ideas this morning about moving towards a post-work society, or the idea that we might be moving towards a post-work society. And speak about a number of meaningful values that people achieve through work. Our second speaker is going to be Isaac Weiner. He's a professor of comparative studies here at OSU, and he's also the director of the Center for the Study of Religion at Ohio State. He's the author of Religion Out Loud, Religious Sound, Public Space, and American Pluralism, and co-director of the American Religious Sounds Project. His current research centers on the workplace as a site of legal regulation and religious practice. So he'll be speaking about the way we think about religion's place at work, and maybe not as a problem to manage, but as a resource that can be mobilized to improve creativity, innovation, and productivity. So it's my great pleasure. Please join me in welcoming our speakers. Thank you. You have to have 2 fingers, 3 fingers.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me? Great. It's excellent to be here at OSU. I've never been here before, and I really look forward to the conference today and all the conversations we'll be having and the connections that we'll make today. I thought I would speak for a few minutes about the possibility of a post-work society, which is something that I find fascinating. And in fact, there's quite a bit of work coming out nowadays within the philosophy of work on the possibility of a post-work society. I've called up a couple of recent books. Let's see. How do I get to that other screen? Okay. One recently published book from Routledge is entitled Debating a Post-Work Future. This is a collection of essays from philosophers who are thinking about the predictions that as we go forward in coming years, decades, within the next century, that we'll see a markedly diminished need for work on the part of societies because technological innovations, advancements in AI, robotics, automation and so forth will be taking a lot of the human jobs from a wide range of sectors, including not only agriculture and manufacturing, but also technology will be taking a lot of the so-called white-collar jobs from people who would otherwise be working in finance or accounting, or even professors, even professions such as doctors and nurses and so forth. Let's see. Another excellent recently published book on this topic is called Automation and Utopia by John Danaher. And he argues that we can expect to see increasingly fewer jobs moving forward in coming years, and that there will not be enough jobs for everyone. He actually thinks that this is a boon to human flourishing, that it can be a good thing. But within the broader debate, there's certainly a lot of disagreement. Now, how do I move back to the screen with my notes on it? Okay, here we are. Within the broader debate among philosophers, there's a lot of disagreement about whether moving toward a post-work future is a good thing. Some people do celebrate this as a boon for human flourishing. They'll think, well, if human beings are liberated from the toil and trouble of maintaining life, from building and repairing the world, then we have more energy to engage in creative and communal activities, to invent and discover and create, to explore and so forth, to relax and enjoy our lives and form social attachments, write novels and so on and so forth. So for some people, a post-work society is something to look forward to. Other people in the debate will say that a post-work society sounds pretty bleak and dystopian, and that's because work is in fact central in human well-being. It's a source of income and benefits in the world as we know it. It's also a source of our social engagements, our social contributions. Work is a primary way that we make ourselves useful in contributing to the world and in meeting the needs and desires of other people. So there are economic, social, and psychological goods that attach to work, and from some perspectives in the broad debate, a post-work society is not something that we should be aiming toward because unemployment is so deleterious to personal and social well-being. Other people, in fact, also doubt whether a post-work society is even a coherent notion. Some of you might remember that as far back as the Republic, Plato thought that the division of labor and the principle of specialization were in fact the very foundations of a society. In thinking about his own utopian society, he thought, well, what is the reason why human beings come together at all to live in societies? He set aside the idea that it was contractual, something like a social contract, and instead he thought, well, we are not naturally self-sufficient. We have needs for one another. We need cobblers and carpenters. We need people to maintain life. We need people to lead. We need warriors. We need philosophers, lovers of knowledge, and so on. And the society represents a coming together of people who have different specializations and who contribute those specializations to the overall community. So running with that notion, it's hard to even gain a coherent idea of a post-work society, since work is so foundational in the very formation of societies. A post-work future might signal the breakdown of society. not to mention bringing additional worries about what people will do for money without employment, and how people will utilize their skills in contributing productively to communities. So at the start, in fact, I'd note that the post-work imagining really has two sorts of foundations. There is an empirical ground for it, where people who are looking into the future are seeing how developments in robotics and automation, artificial intelligence and so forth are leading us toward a diminished need for work, and they're seeing a society of the future where there will not be enough jobs for everyone, which is concerning in some minds. And there's also a normative argument that goes along with the empirical predictions, where some will argue that we should decenter work from our lives. In fact, there are a couple of ways in which work is typically central in life. In the 40-hour work week, work does take center stage in the lives of working people. Right? You wake up in the morning and you get ready for work, and then you commute to work, and then you're working, and then you take a break from work, and then you work some more, and then you come home and you relax and recover from your work day, and then you think about your work. Right? The long arm of the job is that you carry it home at the end of the day. You don't just take off the psychological residue of your employment and leave it at the workplace. Work has a great impact on the people who perform it. It sets a standard of living. It has an incredible impact on the worker. And in that sense, work is central. It provides not only economic goods, but also social and psychological goods. And it tends to dominate life in the 40-hour work week. So according to some who favor the post-work future, it would be better for our well-being if we could find other activities that will crowd out the centrality of work. All right, so let's see. Getting onto my second page now, I'd like to, in fact, register some skepticism about the idea of a post-work society. I think that there are a few reasons why we might be skeptical about whether we are or should be moving toward a post-work society. One reason for skepticism is that machines and robots and automated programs cannot perform a lot of the work that is necessary to human well-being and even to our survival. Many forms of work require the presence, the knowledge, the skill, the creativity, the dexterity, the judgment, the manual execution, not of machines, but of human beings. This would include work such as teaching. I really don't want a robot teaching my child. I want a person to do that. Teaching, being in healthcare, any sort of job that involves making complex and creative decisions. Work in hospitality and the service sector, repair work, emergency services. There are many forms of work that human beings have to perform if it is to be done competently, and that cannot be outsourced to a machine, and that's a major reason for skepticism. In fact, care work is really a good example of work that is basic in human life, but that cannot be outsourced properly to machines. Even if caregivers and nurses and doctors, other healthcare providers use a lot of time-saving, labor-saving technologies in their work, in care work, it is necessary to have that embodied relationship between the caregiver and the receiver of care. Caring involves empathetic interaction. It involves the presence and communication and understanding of a human caregiver. If we were to outsource caregiving to machines, it seems like an abandonment of people to machines and something that would be dystopian. Indeed, human infants, studies have shown, do not survive, let alone thrive, without the presence of a human caregiver. And since care is basic in human life, people are necessary to engage in care work. In fact, I think it's worth thinking about that there are lots of people who cannot get along without the care of others, including the young and the elderly, the disabled, and the sick, the frail. So in all of these cases, human caregivers are needed in order to sustain the lives and contribute to the well-being of others. And that's not the sort of work that can be outsourced to machines. Additionally, along the lines of point number one, I might point out that it is enticing to imagine a future in which we might have something like the replicator on the Starship Enterprise, where you can just ask the machine for Earl Grey tea and it immediately materializes. And how incredibly time-saving and labor-saving this would be, and how it would, in fact, dramatically reduce the amount of work that is required of human beings. But even in that futuristic society, I would point out, there are indefinitely many jobs for human beings to fill. Right? There are admirables, leaders, there are away teams, IT folks, stellar cartographers, tactical officers, science experts, counselors, child caregivers, doctors, nurses, and barbers, and so forth. So even in the sort of utopian futuristic society that we might enjoy envisioning when we think along the lines of Star Trek, we see that a futuristic society still has a need for people to serve in indefinitely many roles rather than outsourcing all of the work to machines. So I think this highlights the point that even as advances in technology can minimize the burdens of work, they do not eliminate it entirely. And in fact, Hannah Arendt in The Human Condition really emphasized that point, that 100 gadgets and a bunch of robots in the cellar can minimize your burden of labor, but those gadgets and robots don't eliminate entirely the need for human labor. Somebody has to operate those technologies, which are not always entirely time-saving and labor-reducing. Additionally, I would suggest that a post-work society is not in fact a boon for human flourishing, because there are a plurality of human goods that attach to work in particular. These values include things like meaningfulness and contributing to the world through the use of one's skills, the feeling of being useful. Right, work is more than a means to a paycheck. It is a source of the development and exercise of skills. It is a source for achieving esteem and recognition from one's peers. It is a source of pride and honor and accomplishment. Sometimes it is a source of identity. It is a way of inserting oneself in a social community. It is a contribution to a community that makes a person useful to a world beyond themselves. So there are a lot of intangible goods, so to speak, that would come from work. And a world without any kind of work seems like a world in which we would struggle to thrive. Also, a fascinating question about how we might support ourselves and have money in a world without work. This often leads people in the debate to think about universal basic income. This is often proposed as a solution to the inevitable question: what are people to do in a world without work, where where some people don't have enough jobs to go around? And there's a lot to be said for the universal basic income. It's a way of promoting freedom and lessening inequality. It's a way of reducing exploitation and oppression. But on the other hand, some people do question whether it is feasible and even desirable to have the universal basic income. For instance, Elizabeth Anderson, who I understand was here in the fall, is known for her arguments against the universal basic income. She says it represents taking without giving, which is wrong. And more broadly, I think that the thought experiment of a world without work, in which people are living on the basis of a UBI, it sort of brings to mind that it would be difficult to sustain a UBI in a post-work future, because work is the very foundation of personal and social prosperity. And without the productivity and prosperity that come from work, our society would soon not have enough to distribute through the UBI. Now, how am I doing on time? Okay, great, because I do have a bit more to say, although I think that what I've just said amounts to a hearty amount of skepticism about the idea of a post-work future. I do think it's correct that we should be prepared for a world with a markedly diminished need for work, and that as we think about the future of work, we should put ourselves in the mindset of accepting a social norm of shorter working hours. You should be thinking about the 4-day work week, or the 6-hour workday, supplanting the historical construction of a 40-hour work week, right? The 40-hour work week is not some rational Archimedean starting point that is unchangeable and just given. It's a historical construction and a very hard-won gain on the part of labor movements in the 20th century. So as a historical construction, it's certainly open to questioning and to change. And as we move forward and we think about the future of work, especially alongside the technological advancements that will dramatically reduce the social need for work, I do think it's important to open ourselves up to a shorter work week or a shorter work day, and that represents an important truth in those who would propose and defend a post-work society. So I myself would not embrace the idea of a post-work society for the reasons I've given. But I do think that shorter working hours and increasing leisure represent important goals as we move forward and think about work. And I point out also that even though work is central in human flourishing, and it is doubtful that a person can flourish without work, since work is the linchpin of so many economic, social, and psychological goods, it is not the case that we need as much work as we have in our lives in order to thrive. And I'm sure the moderator will understand and appreciate that point, that more is not always better when it comes to work. Both you and other people can certainly thrive on the basis of reduced hours in work. Right? So a few hours a day in the far out future might be perfectly satisfactory for personal and social needs for work. And also in an article that I published entitled Leisure and Respect for Working People, I try to show that if we really unpack the meaning of respect and we apply it to the working world and we think about what it means to respect working people, it should mean, at least in part, increasing leisure hours and free time for working people so that the energies and the productivity of working people are not entirely gobbled up by systems that rely upon their labor. Increasing leisure is a way of recognizing that workers have a well-being that they should be pursuing outside of work. So all things considered then, I do see a just and morally improved future, including shorter working hours, but that's not to say that the future of work should include a post-work society. As I was saying, I think there are a lot of reasons for skepticism of a post-work world, but on the other hand, reducing the amount of time that we spend at work is an important way of responding to structural issues that will be coming, such as the need to reduce unemployment by spreading around the limited good of good work. All right, well, I think that my 15 minutes are probably about up, but those are some thoughts that I wanted to share today. Thanks.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me here. Delighted to be a part of this panel. I'm going to speak from a fairly different vantage point, but I think that there will be some interesting points of both overlap and contention that I think will emerge in our conversation that I hope will be generative and productive. I approach this discussion not as a philosopher, but as a historian and ethnographer of American religion, who's increasingly interested in the workplace as a site of religion and law in the United States and globally. I'll start with a quick story. My interest in the workplace began about 15 years ago when I was invited to facilitate a diversity lunch and learn session for an IT hub of a major national department store that will go unnamed for the time being. The head of this diversity lunch and learn series reached out to me because they had what she described as an incident in the workplace. A Muslim employee had gone into the bathroom, the employee bathroom, and washed his feet in the sink prior to conducting prayer, and other employees were quote-unquote disgusted by seeing an employee put his feet into this shared common sink space. There were tensions rising. She wanted to address this in some way. And she reached out to me as a scholar of religious studies to come and run a session in thinking about religious diversity in the workplace. But she was also quite upfront with me that she said she realized when this happened that in the years she had been running this session, this series, they had never talked about religion before. They had done sessions on race and on gender and ethnicity, on sexuality, on veteran status, on age, on all sorts of other kinds of categories of identity, and had never talked or thought much about religion before. And she was extremely nervous about doing so. She didn't know how it would be responded to. She didn't know what was appropriate, what wasn't appropriate. And she made a request of me that she said, I'd like you to address every single example of religious practice that might show up in the workplace. Make sure that one of the examples on the list is a Muslim employee washing his feet, but do not mention that that happened here. Which was a tall task. I did my best. We had a really, really lively discussion. But it seemed to me that her directive to me was really indicative of a larger kind of trend or way of thinking about religion and its place at work. Reactionary, reticent, hesitant, unsure, uncertain, not knowing what to do. And it was very clear, right, that they really had deliberately never really wanted to engage with religion at work. This is a very typical approach. Until fairly recently, both scholars and business leaders have tended to regard the workplace as properly kept a secular space where religion is conceived as a problem, something inappropriate, requiring careful policing, special accommodation, but as something uniquely disruptive, divisive, a liability or risk to be managed rather than mobilized. In the last decade or so, those attitudes have begun to change rapidly in ways that I'm actually quite skeptical of. So I'm going to describe some of these trends and then actually come back to raise some critical questions about them that I hope we can consider further. Over the last several years, I've been studying a group of advocacy organizations that are working to transform the ways that corporate managers think about religion at work, away from conceiving of it as a problem that must be carefully managed or studiously avoided, to a resource that can be mobilized to enhance greater employee creativity, innovation, and personal fulfillment. Pushing back against historic taboos on religion at work, they aim to capitalize on employees' religious differences rather than ignoring them. As the argument goes, they say that employees want to bring their whole selves to work, and that this must include their religious and spiritual selves, and that therefore it is in corporations' best interests to make space and allow employees to do so. That making greater space for religious expression at work will improve morale, retention, productivity, innovation, and therefore religious diversity is not a problem or a threat, but actually fundamental to bolstering a company's economic bottom line. Advocates call this the business case for religious freedom, built on a set of economic rather than legal or moral arguments directed toward corporate leaders and managers. In doing so, they are borrowing explicitly on a set of arguments and strategies that were developed in the context of racial and gender equity over the course of the 1980s and 1990s. In a fairly well-told story in the 1980s, we saw kind of distinct shifts from more race-conscious affirmative action policies driving corporations' efforts to diversify the workplace, to arguments grounded explicitly in questions of social justice, to this more kind of amorphous concept of diversity as a good, consonant with corporate and neoliberal values, diversity as good for business. Religion was fairly late to this game, and I can say much more, and I'm happy to do so in the discussion, about why religion was an afterthought to those conversations, why it came so late to it, how eventually it kind of got added to it, why in this moment specifically, debates about religion have achieved real salience. If you look, for example, at the number of complaints filed with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, complaints about religious discrimination have just skyrocketed in the last few years in ways that are clearly indicative of a larger trend that I can say much more about. But in the time I have today, what I wanted to do is sketch out just a couple of the specific strategies promoted by these advocacy groups for what it means to build, for what they think it means to build more religiously inclusive workplaces, describe a little bit of their promise, but then raise some critical questions that I think will raise some broader issues for us, both about thinking about the future of religion and, more to our purposes, the future of work. The most prominent advocacy organization pushing for the business case for religious freedom is called the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation, or RFBF. Founded in 2014, RFBF describes its mission as to educate the global business community, policymakers, non-government organizations, and consumers about the positive power that faith and religious freedom for all, including those with no religious faith, they are quick to add, have on workplaces and the economy. RFBF has been at the forefront of promoting this business case for religious freedom, addressing their arguments directly to corporate leaders of Fortune 500 companies, and increasingly to government officials throughout the world, working closely now with the governments of Great Britain, Malaysia, India, and a number of other countries, increasingly in the Asian context. There's a whole geopolitical dimension to this that I can also talk about at a later point. RFBF, the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation, promotes a number of initiatives. One of their centerpiece work is what's called the REDI Index, the Religion, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Index. And all of those letters, EDI, may be on their way out, which I'll talk more about as well, as you can imagine. But they created a set of criteria by which to evaluate and benchmark corporate success at including religion in the workplace. And they evaluate Fortune 500 companies on an annual basis on how well they do. And corporate leaders compete to try to get higher on this benchmark. And they are celebrated every year at an annual conference that aims to equip employees with tools for making the positive case to their employers about how to make greater space for religious expression. The index, of course, does not merely adopt a neutral set of criteria, but actually therefore constructs what are the criteria by which companies should properly be measured for being more religiously inclusive. And RFBF pushes a number of strategies, but they really spend the great deal of their effort pushing two in particular that I want to focus on in the brief time that I have. The first is making greater space within companies and corporations for religion-oriented employee resource groups. Many of you may be familiar with this. ERGs, or employee resource groups, are one of in the last 20 years, a widespread strategy being used across kind of the DEI sector of how to improve and enhance diversity in the workplace. These are basically identity-based affinity groups. They date as early as the 1960s in the context of race, gradually expanded to create spaces to talk about race, gender, age, veteran status, sexuality, a number of different kinds of forms of identity-based groups. But religion has, again, been very late to the game. Only in the last decade or so have companies really started to create religion-based employee resource groups. They do this in a number of different ways. There are ones that are faith-specific. So a company or a university might have Jewish-specific employee resource group, a Christian employee resource group, a Sikh employee resource group, a Muslim employee resource group, et cetera. Or they might have an interfaith group meant to bring together people of all different religions to talk and share about the needs of religious folks in the workplace. Religion-based ERGs support a variety of activities, celebrating holidays, educating their fellow coworkers, helping companies be more sensitive to the needs of customers, or helping the company avoid doing things that are religiously insensitive. They have faced a lot of skepticism from corporate managers, concerned that religion-based ERGs might lead to proselytizing or religious harassment in the workplace. There have been issues of tension between religion-based ERGs and LGBT groups, especially when it involves conservative religious groups in the workplace. And a lot of managers wonder if they are even legal, displaying kind of a mistaken understanding of what both the First Amendment and Title VII does and does not allow when it comes to religious accommodation in the work. Advocates like RFBF insist that religion-based ERGs will make employees feel more valued, more included, and most importantly, more likely to stay. They argue that it's a really important retention strategy for corporations today. For the last 15 years or so, the ERG movement, when it comes to religion, has been especially dominated by Christians, Christian groups, looking to make space for things like prayer and Bible study within the workplace. But over the last few years, for reasons that I'm happy to talk much more about, they've grown increasingly popular within minority communities. So a recent survey, for example, of Jewish employees nationwide found that 44% of Jewish employee resource group members were not involved with any other Jewish organization outside of work, and that 24% of them described their employee resource group as the primary place where they connected with Jewish life. That means that these are becoming increasingly a central place in which Americans practice and experience and connect with religious community and religious practice. And I think largely an overlooked and neglected site of where religion is happening when we talk about the centrality that work plays in people's life, that is increasingly a place where people's religious lives are also happening. The second strategy that RFBF pursues or advocates for are what are called corporate chaplaincy programs. For those not familiar with this is a model that builds on models of chaplaincy within the healthcare world or the military world that puts into the private corporate workplace typically ministers, although they are often not actually ordained or really regulated in any way, but people with training in some way in pastoral care who are there to attend to the spiritual and emotional needs of a company's employees. Like hospital or military chaplains, they are typically trained within one particular religious tradition, but they are there explicitly to offer their services to anyone, regardless of identity or affiliation. In the words of the chaplaincy movement, they offer what's called a ministry of presence, offering counseling and care, noting that if work is where we spend most of our time, then that is where chaplains ought to be, meeting people where they are, providing pastoral care, not coincidentally, usually at a fraction of the cost of licensed mental health professionals. Both of these strategies, religion-based employee resource groups and corporate chaplaincy programs, address real needs and profound problems. Americans today report surprisingly high levels of religious discrimination at work and profound levels of stress, anxiety, and feelings of isolation. And it is important for corporations to respond to these needs and to consider how they can make their workplaces more inclusive. And at the same time, if I can take just a couple more minutes, I want to offer for our discussion, for our thought, a couple risks, concerns, questions that I think we ought to be asking about these strategies and thinking about the future of work. I'm just going to offer three fairly quickly. One, most obvious, are concerns about Christian hegemony, the ways that mobilization of discourses of pluralism are often used explicitly to make space for Christian evangelism. The largest companies providing corporate chaplains at this point, and many of them are third-party contractors who contract with corporations to provide chaplains on call. The largest companies doing this are all explicitly Christian, who only hire Christian chaplains, although they often downplay that in their public materials that go out to corporate managers. And while they claim to be there to offer ministry and counsel to everyone, many are clearly there to evangelize. There's really kind of no question about that. We can tell you about, that feels fairly obvious. I think we can talk about that. A second concern is the ways that this movement to draw on strategies developed in the context of racial and gender equality and then apply them to the context of religion has led to a very unstable relationship between religion diversity initiatives and other kinds of DEI initiatives, especially in a moment when DEI initiatives more broadly are under attack. The RFBF and groups like it argue strenuously that including religion will actually lead to more inclusive policies across the board. As I noted, there have been some limited examples of tension between religious and LGBT groups, part of a new kind of politics of religious freedom, through which, again, primarily conservative religious folks have mobilized the rhetoric of conscience or sincere belief to opt out of things like participating in diversity trainings or having to be subject to mandates to respect other forms of racial and sexual inclusion. But even more in this political moment when DEI is now suddenly under attack, groups like Religious Freedom and Business Foundation, which for many years now have hitched their wagon to DEI initiatives, are now suddenly unhitching it fairly quickly and proving to be fairly unreliable partners. So just recently, for example, RFBF put out a major press release that said, in this moment, when we are all rightly recognizing that there are many problems with the ways DEI policies have been enacted, we should not, in their words, throw out the baby with the bathwater and make sure that we are still committing to being religiously inclusive, even while we rethink the ways that we handle things like race and gender. Much more to say about that too. But for our purposes of thinking about work, the thing that I really want to kind of conclude with or finish with is the ways that this whole discourse of the business case for religious freedom serves ultimately to instrumentalize religion, rendering it useful only to the extent that it can be rendered resonant with and supportive of capitalistic values and corporate mission statements. By their very definition, for example, employee resource groups must exist to accommodate the corporation and its values. To receive formal recognition, employee resource groups must require an executive sponsor and must develop an explicit statement of how their work will advance the company's mission and purpose. Employee resource group leaders must articulate how their activities will help the company do better business. And in so doing, they learn to translate their religious aspirations through the idioms of business, taking on the instrumental logic of work. And there's lots of examples I can offer of this. In many ways, these policies and strategies don't just accommodate religion at work, but serve to channel employees' religious commitments into forms that can then be leveraged more readily for the corporation's benefit, making sure that religion and religious values will be non-adversarial, will not be sources of critique, but rather fully consonant with the needs of the business, neutering it, as I've suggested, as a source of possible critique. Another way of thinking about this is to say that if employees want to bring their whole selves to the workplace, these strategies in many ways allow the corporation to harness those employees' whole selves for their own ends. And I think a lot of this discussion about the ways that employees are encouraged to find meaning and self-fulfillment through work can often lead to real gross situations of exploitation that we can talk much more about, I think. In short, there are ways that these strategies serve actually to advance and support neoliberal values. And you can see this finally, the last minute I'll take, in corporate chaplaincy strategies that by and large serve to personalize and individualize problems of unjust work conditions rather than addressing them as structural problems that require political or collective action. When I've heard chaplains talk about their work, I've heard them describe sitting with employees to talk about when employees are experiencing stress due to not having enough health care, due to debt, due to losing their jobs, all sorts of issues that the way that chaplains approach them as this is a problem this individual is experiencing, how can I be there with them to support? Rather than suggesting that the corporation has any possible responsibility for the fact that the employees are experiencing things like debt, inadequate healthcare, inadequate mental services, etc. There are ways that the chaplaincy works as much to absolve the corporation of the responsibility for the stress and emotional concerns that the employees are experiencing, rather than simply responding, right, to those issues. Last anecdote I will finish with, I heard a chaplain for Tyson chicken processing. Tyson has been at the forefront of this movement. They have hundreds of chaplains employed in their care. A Tyson chaplain said that when I sit with one of my food processing plant workers, I want to make sure they understand that they're not just cutting up chickens, but they're feeding the world. And I don't mean to be overly cynical. I think it's a beautiful sentiment that similar way we can talk about imparts dignity in a very important way to work that can other be thoroughly dismissed and degraded. And yet at the same time, as it's rendering that work meaningful, I think serves to thoroughly obfuscate the unsafe working conditions of that employee and the environmental impact of the work more broadly that the corporate chaplain absolves any responsibility for. So I think it's incredibly important that corporations do more to think about how to be religiously inclusive and create workplaces that are more responsive to the needs of their employees. But I'm concerned about the implications and the consequences of the ways that many are choosing to do that in this moment, and I welcome further conversation about that. Thanks.
Well, thank you. This sets the table wonderfully for us. And let me just say that the plan for the rest of our time here is that we'll have a little bit of moderated discussion between the three of us to kind of get us rolling. And then we'll save the last half hour, 25 minutes for Q&A for everyone else here. And we have a microphone up over here that when that time comes, we'll invite you to just come and form a line at the microphone to ask any questions. And for sure, they've just served up an awful lot of things that you might have comments and questions about. So I'm looking forward to sort of diving into this dialogue. One of the first questions that I wanted to ask, and this is really for Andrea, I think, more than anything, I was thinking as you were talking about some of the wondering, well, you know, less work would be good, more is not better. I'm completely understanding that. But I wondered if retirement is any kind of a case study to sort of reflect on these values a little bit, because I know there seem to be two different models for people who retire. One is the person who retires and doesn't know what to do with themselves. They're unhappy, they're shit, you know, even if they're, you know, reached a good retirement age, but they just can't feel like themselves anymore because they don't have the meaning and purpose of their work. And then there's other people who retire and they're sort of like, woohoo, you know, and they're fishing and, you know, whatever else it is, and they're so glad to be done with my work. So I'm wondering if that's just a difference in personalities, or do we assume that they had very different work situations? But does that shed light on the way work is meaningful to different people in different ways, and is that something that you maybe think about as a way to further examine the themes that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think that retirement is interesting to think about in the context of my argument that meaningful work is important in human flourishing. I mean, some people might feel that they've done a lifetime of work and they've had enough and they've done their contribution, and now it is time to relax and enjoy life, and they feel no loss at leaving behind the life of work. It does depend upon the individual, no doubt, but I do think from an Aristotelian perspective that employing activity in one way or another will contribute to retirement going well for the person who is retired. So it is important that they keep their minds sharp and their bodies agile by engaging in physical and intellectual activity. And some people do indeed use retirement as a time to volunteer to communities. And in that respect, we have a form of work even in retirement. And in fact, it's an interesting question philosophically as to how we would adequately define work and whether work has to be paid in order to count as work. And I do think that work is not well defined as paid activity because so much non-paid activity does intuitively count as work. Volunteer work does seem to be a recognizable form of work, as does work done by students, right? It is focused, time and effort directed toward a goal. So indeed, when you're performing activities in and around the home or in the community, or you have leisure activities, all of that does contribute to human flourishing in retirement. But yes, as you were suggesting, there do seem to be people who will enjoy their retirement without much activity, even as others will thrive through activity.
Is there a moment where work became sort of more separated from our basic purpose in life? Because I think of sometimes as you're, going up through school, there's sort of like this joke, it's like, oh, well, wait until you get in the real world and you got to work all day. It's almost as though there's this assumption that work means drudgery or something like that, which seems to militate against these more enriching sort of aspects of work. And so maybe then we look forward to being done with work so we can get back to a good life. Mm-hmm. But maybe that's an artificial sort of setup or a separation of how we even think of work in the first place.
Right, a lot of work is not experienced as a source of human flourishing because it is burdening. There's so much of it. It might be felt as tedious or draining, taxing, even dirty or disgusting. So it's something that people want to escape from in order to achieve well-being outside of work. But there are also plenty of opportunities for people to thrive within their work because work is such an avenue for the exercise of capabilities and skills that come from human beings and that allow us to contribute to communities. So there are many forms of work, although not all forms of work, that allow that kind of intrinsic satisfaction. But yes, for many people, work is something that they seek to escape from.
I've got a question for Isaac too, and this comes partly, I was fascinated by your stat that 44% of Jewish work groups, people, that's their only engagement with their own Judaism or something like that, which sort of suggests, that the workplace actually can be a meaningful place for religious engagement, perhaps, in a way that, I guess what I was thinking as I was trying to think about the compare and contrast what you both were talking about, there's slightly different projects here, but in terms of flourishing, as we generally think about flourishing, one way is like, well, people flourish as part of their religious communities. That's why it's so important to have religious accommodations at work, because it's so much about your identity, your view of the good life, and what's meaningful to you. And from that perspective, people would say, you've married yourself to your work. It's like you're forsaking the richer forms of community, and you've married your work. Like, what about your spouse? This kind of thing, right? And so religion is a source of true well-being, whereas work, maybe it's more drudgery or something. But on the other hand, there's this sense that, well, maybe work does have a lot to do with our meaning, right? A lot of people here can relate to the fact that your identity does center around your work. So there's almost sort of this tension here of, where's the source of real value and meaning and identity? And we make religious accommodations because religion should be that place, or community should be that place, but work can be that place too. And I wonder if there's reflections that you have about sort of where those tensions lie, or what you might sort out from that.
Yeah, I think without question, it's not a coincidence that a lot of the talk about bringing one's whole self to work and experiencing one's whole self at work has coincided with a dramatic increase in the hours that one spends at work. Carolyn Chen, a sociologist at Berkeley, wrote a wonderful book a couple of years ago on religion in the tech industry in Silicon Valley. For the folks that she studies, a 40-hour work week is quaint, right? Let alone 30 hours or 20 hours. They're working 80 hours, 90 hours, 100 hours. And part of what she was interested in is both the ways that those tech corporations make use of what you might call kind of traditional religion, how mindfulness and meditation practices and other kinds of Asian-derived religious practices factor more and more prominently in those contexts, but also the way that work itself becomes almost kind of a form of religion for them. And she, as a sociologist, she has concerns about how it's taking people away from religious community, kind of outside of work. I'm less invested in that fight. I do believe, my scholarship in general, I'm really interested in the ostensibly secular spaces of American life that are actually critically important sites of both religious practice and even more of religious interaction and exchange. So I think workplaces absolutely are a space where this is happening, and it's why I think we need to pay attention to it, study the ways that it is happening, and think about the ways that it is happening in ways that I think are conducive to meaningful experience, in ways that I think are actually quite detrimental and problematic. But absolutely, we ought to be paying attention to what is happening there, and not necessarily in a way that is normatively devaluing it. More people spend more time at work than they do in religious institutions. And if we're only looking to religious institutions for where religion happens, especially at a time when the Pew Forum continues to remind us that institutional attendance is declining and declining, it's why absolutely we need to be thinking about both the positive and detrimental ways that people are finding forms of meaning and flourishing at the workplace. But especially, though, to go back to Andrew's point though too, we also have to think in diverse ways about both what work is and what the workplace is. The conversations that I described are happening almost exclusively within the context of kind of corporate white-collar work. When I've talked to folks working wage labor, 9-to-5 retail jobs, and say, are you a member of an employee resource group? They say, what the hell is that? I just want to get home and take care of my family. I don't have time for that. I don't get paid for that. That's not part of it. So we have to be thinking as well, obviously, about these different kind of contexts of work, I think, when we think about what it means for it to be a place of meaning making.
And I may follow up a little bit, and Andrew, you may have some reflections on that too, but I was going to sort of layer in another piece. We had Randy Kern here last year, I think it was, talking about sustainable flourishing. And this ports over into my area of thinking about sustainability and sort of environmental values. But he was suggesting that, what we know about human flourishing is that people need relationships, people need a sense of competence, and people need a sense of autonomy. All of those things relate to the workplace and are very much in accord with what you talk about, the values of work. And I guess what I wonder to some extent is, so how central is work? In a view like that, and in fact, his message was that the UN is maybe going to move away from the Sustainable Development Goals around 2030 and move towards a sustainable flourishing sort of framework, because the SDGs aren't actually working that well to sort of bring in a kind of flourishing. So maybe more of a focus on sustainable flourishing would actually be good. I feel like that's what you're talking about, is a kind of a larger vision of sustainable flourishing. But is work really central to that, or is this other thing of flourishing, of which work is an important piece, but not the whole picture? I just wonder how you would juggle those things.
Yeah, I think that there are a number of reasons why work is central to flourishing, and one of those reasons is that we spend so much of our waking hours and productive energies at work. Since work absorbs several hours of our waking energies and efforts, in the importance of finding work that fits us and that is meaningful and that allows us to thrive is quite obvious. I think that work impacts the person either for better or for worse. So people who are dragged down by their work have a diminished well-being even outside of work. If they feel that they suffer indignities at work, for instance, this affects them both on and off the job. So part of the reason why work is so impactful on our flourishing is that we spend so much time at it, and we do draw a number of values from it, such as identity and dignity and pride and self-esteem and self-respect, and the need to contribute to the well-being of others.
Can I ask a question? Yes. A question about that. I'm curious, which is, I'd say it's not lost on me, I guess, that the sectors of work that you described as least likely to fade in a post-work society, teaching, healthcare, kind of the care work, are precisely those fields of work that critics of work have often pointed to as kind of the most ripe for exploitation. I'm thinking here about like Sarah Jaffe's book, Work Won't Love You Back, right, where she argues that kind of the ideology that this is work in which you flourish, that has real meaning, where you're caring for others, is also what therefore allows for that work to be grossly underpaid, for the conditions to be grossly unjust, for people to be exploited because of that, precisely that ideology of you're getting other kinds of benefits, right? The social and psychological benefits you receive, you don't need the economic benefits, you don't need better workplace conditions for this. And I'm genuinely curious, like, how do you think about that question or that tension?
Well, I think that it's important to work towards structural solutions to problems of overwork and exploitation in care work. One interesting possibility to think about is that care work should be shared more often than it is, that there shouldn't be one person who is burdened with caretaking for one individual who needs care, but rather the just solution would be that many people contribute to the labor of caring for other people so that one individual is not overburdened. But indeed, reducing working hours and paying more adequately are structural solutions to systemic issues of exploitation in care work. So indeed, it's important that teachers and caregivers have a lesser workload and also good remuneration in order that exploitation can be minimized.
I have sort of one last little bit question I'm curious about. I was appreciative of your expression there. I just referenced, the doctor, I'm just a country doctor. So even in this high-tech sort of space, there was this allusion to a simpler time or a simpler culture or something like that. And I wonder if the culture of work in the U.S., we've been describing kind of a white-collar sort of culture, and there's a diversity of cultures of work, but are there other cultures of work in other places that you might point to saying, hey, that could actually point a direction for the larger culture of work in the United States?
I mean, I think it's important to recognize that cross-culturally and historically, work does not necessarily have the prominence or the dominance that it often does in our own culture, where the 40-hour work week is standard. There are many ways in which communities have organized productive activity. And in fact, we seem to be on a path of increasing the amount of work that we're doing, whereas in human history, we do see that communities can thrive with a lesser amount of work. So in that respect, I mean, yes, we should look more broadly toward other ways of organizing work and of integrating work within life so that it is not so burdensome.
All right, this is sounding hopeful. Yeah.
Go ahead. I have a comment to that, which is Greg, I actually appreciated your kind of offhand throwaway comment about the religious basis of the sabbatical. I have an article in which I trace a shift over time that when the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission first started thinking about questions of religious accommodations, it was almost entirely in the context of Sabbath observers, Sabbatarians, Orthodox Jews, Seventh-day Adventists, Seventh-day Baptists, other groups who required time off from work on Saturdays to observe the Sabbath and were advocating for time off from work to experience religious meaning, rest, values, etc., outside of the context of work. And when you look at the trends that I'm studying and analyzing over the last several years, what you see instead is this shift toward an argument of expressing and realizing one's religious values through work, as we've said, through work and at work. And I think in many ways, those of us who are concerned about structural conditions of work, of inequality, questions of too much work, of the centrality of work, there's a lot to be learned from the older model that argued not for a right to religious fulfillment through work, but to a right to meaning and value outside of work that models like Sabbath observance provide.
Well, I'd like to shift gears. I suspect there's some questions percolating here. So go ahead and, if you've got a question, go ahead and get up and get in line for the microphone, and we'll engage everyone in discussion and dialogue.
I just happened to be sitting very close to the mic. I wanted to make sure I didn't beat everyone here. First of all, thank you for this. This is a great way to start a dreary Friday morning in the March of OSU. So thank you for helping us think about the ways that value are playing into our workplace. So, hey, have a question about, we're at a college, and our college is primarily dominated by folks that would fit in the like Gen Z category, who I have noticed as being on the cusp of that generation, a push towards identifying differently than folks have previously with work. Like, I get the idea that like my parents very much like chose the job that was going to be a secure mode of payment, and then my generation was urged to like, no, do what you love. Like, please just find your passion, because you're going to have to be there for forever. And then I see this push among like Gen Z populations and younger populations to push back against this idea that your job is going to be the thing that you're most passionate about. And if anything, that's a trap. But there's this dual-sided relationship I see them having about how you identify with your work and the role that passion plays in your work. So there's this sense in which the work is just the thing that you like punch in, punch out of. If anything, you really shouldn't be defined by the occupation that you have. But in the same sense, there's this idea that you should bring the core values that you have into the workplace to change it to better fit the ways that you identify. So it's not about finding a job that best fits the way that you identify to have it define your passion, but rather find something, either have a clock in, clock out relationship with it, and or in the same breath, bring in your commitments to equality, to sustainability, to inclusion into a space so that it changes, so it's something that you can identify with while still holding this kind of arm's length relationship to it. The question I have is, how does this fit with what both of you are saying about the reservations we might have about pushing away from identifying with our work, or bringing more aspects of ourself into our work, whether it's our religious commitments or our desire for community? I just invite you to speak on, especially concerning the future of work, where we might see these trends going, and if either like approach has a seed of something that might be helpful for us going forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. That's a lot to think about. But yeah, the newer attitude, so to speak, of punching in and punching out and not looking to work as a source of identity and fulfillment, it does reflect a certain wisdom that there can be the potential for exploitation when we look to work as a source of social and psychological personal values and so forth. So that, yes, I would advise a young person to not build their life around their work. But nevertheless, we do spend a lot of time at work, and it is an outlet for our energies. And so somebody who is merely punching in and out is going to feel worn down by their work if in fact it is alienating. So perhaps there isn't so much of a dichotomy between, on the one hand, hoping for work that exercises our skills and abilities that we can really get involved in, and on the other hand, drawing good boundaries between us and our work, not marrying your job, so to speak, or trying to draw too much from it. I mean, it's quite possible both to improve the conditions of work and to minimize the time that we spend at work. But I do like your suggestion of balancing your life so that it is not lopsided in the direction of work.
Think about this more. I mean, I think it's all really helpful. I mean, I don't want to be a broken record. Like I continually come back first to kind of the structural critique, right, which is to note that Gen Z habits and attitudes toward work are being shaped within a context of an economy where a social safety net has been decimated, where a commitment to providing public services has been decimated, where why long-term good jobs don't exist is because the idea of like a corporation having commitments to you with pension funds and all of these things has gone away. And it's been replaced by express yourself, right, through your work, and kind of individualizing of your values and your choices and your flourishing, kind of, again, individualizing in a way that makes, so I think it is healthy in some ways for these generations to be skeptical of claims that work ought to be how they define themselves or through which. I'm largely taken by Sarah Jaffe's argument that work won't love you back. I'm much more cynical when I come to kind of these discussions and skeptical of it. So I think there's one piece of what I think I would say about that. I see a lot of pressure, I think. When I see my own students here at OSU, so much pressure being put on them to know at younger and younger ages what they want to do. The number of conversations I've had with undergraduate students over the last year who, because at 20 years old, they don't know what their passion is, what their thing is that they want to do for life, that pressure is being put on them for all sorts of structural and political reasons that they ought to push back at, and we ought to support them in pushing back at, that make me very nervous and uncomfortable. None of that exactly answers your question, but it's kind of rambling thoughts that I would have, I think, in thinking about the ways that I'm at least seeing students approaching a very uncertain and uneasy labor market, what it looks like.
Thank you. Isaac, I would first, being out of the agriculture sector, find it interesting you used the word rendering while you were talking about the poultry plant. So in that equation, that's kind of odd. But
Totally accidental.
more along the line, if autonomy, robotics, artificial intelligence are going to be the influence to less work, okay, more freedom. How do you see community structures and ownership structures changing that those are not extractive, but part of that support of that happening?
Let's see.
It'll be extractive if you don't have some ownership structure, those technologies and those processes. How do you see communities changing? Maybe even how they operate to support that type of environment within there?
And if I can add just a little bit, it's one of the things I witnessed. So my extended family is agricultural off the farm, and there's been a massive shift since the 1960s, where my cousin is trying to take over the Height Susan farm, and it's a huge operation. And you can't just give your farm over to your kid now because he's got to run a multi-million-dollar kind of thing. And the land he farms, like 2,000 or 3,000 acres, used to support 20 families. And now it only supports his family. And he has to sell seed and do several other things too, just to get by. So it's not even enough, right? And so there's been a real change of like the value in farming. Like 20 families could have been supported there, but now the profit of that goes to big machines and all that, right, kind of thing. And so what happens to our community structure? What happens, and I've seen some sort of advertising that essentially says, farming is hard. You know, you gotta really work hard, but you could equally be saying, wait a second, we've had the meaning ripped out from under us because it's a different kind of farming now. And is that?
A little along that line, the other thing would be like if you look in areas where there's a strong Amish population, you see them flourishing right now because they have control over that complete system and they're incorporating technologies into there. I guess the other example would be like maybe a kibbutz in Israel or something along that line. So how do you see the structures maybe of a community changing to push in that direction?
Yeah, I would offer first that it does seem to be the case that ownership and community can make a difference to the meaningfulness of work. When you are contributing to a community with which you deeply identify, that enhances the meaningfulness of work. When you are working your own land, that does contribute to the meaningfulness of your work because it's a way of integrating your activity in a broader social and physical context of your life. I mean, one way of making meaning is by drawing connections. So I do think there's the importance of community ownership that impacts the meaningfulness of work. But you know, as to the issue that you were also suggesting about you know, who is owning and controlling the reduction in working hours owing to automation, often we do see that companies that are seeking to maximize profits will reduce working hours and employ something more of a gig economy and a lot of part-time work, and that seems to benefit the company interests at the expense of the employee interests. So I think that when philosophers are imagining a post-work future and how this could potentially be a just society that works for working people, I mean, they're really imagining a move away from capitalism and an obsession with productivity and profit toward a more community-centered ideal in which people are contributing a more minimal amount of work to communities and in turn having more free time for themselves. So it is challenging for philosophers to think about how we can support the interests of working people and move to a more just economy. in a world that has a lesser need for work. But as you were suggesting, ownership makes a difference in meaningfulness, and it makes a difference in terms of the power differential as well.
I would just want to get some more thoughts about you all's perception of the gig economy in terms of the religious aspects of it, as well as the meaningful work in terms of people who are now, working either 2 or 3 jobs, who have the, have with the gig economy having that flexibility to do that. But then also, as we have, like you mentioned, those corporations who now put the onus on the individual worker or the part-time contractor, how do those same ideals of like religion and things come about when you need to do these particular jobs to continue to make ends meet and things like that? So I just want to get your thoughts on the gig economy and how it plays into the overall conversation that we're having.
It's a great and really important question, and obviously one of the ways that conditions of work have changed so dramatically over the last decade or so. On the one hand, there's an argument I could imagine saying that that one could suggest the gig economy is beneficial in some ways, in that when you look at kind of debates about, let's say, accommodations in the workplace, one of the arguments that's often made is the best way a company should proceed is by kind of maximizing flexibility. We get into debates when like some groups get accommodations and some don't, or the managers have to draw sticky lines around who does and who doesn't, and what can the company do, or what counts as religious and what doesn't. Why do you get off Saturday for religion, but you don't get off Saturday because you want to go to a Buckeye game, or like whatever it is. And a lot of that is resolved when a company is just generally more flexible in its policies for leave, and its policies for work, and its policies for working at home versus at the workplace. And gig economy is like maximally flexible in some ways, right? You set your own hours, you're your own boss, you're your own, you decide who you want to work with. And there's a lot about that flexibility that is a good. But of course, it's emerging out of a structural condition that is absolving the corporation and company of responsibility for providing benefits, providing stable income that allows for flourishing outside of work, that makes you always hustling, always your own brand, always kind of this entrepreneurial model that is actually much in line with the history of American religion as well, right? A lot of the history of American religion is of shifting religion in some ways away from forms of collectivity to entrepreneurial economies, where you don't like this church, go down the street and start your own and become a preacher over there, and that storefront is right for whatever it is. And it's a lot of kind of the history of American religious freedom is one of kind of that individual entrepreneurial gig economy spirit. But of course that is in tension with other kinds of values of collective organizing, collectivity that are crucially important, and especially at a time when the other trend when it comes to religion and work that I didn't get a chance to talk about today, but have much more to say about, a growing trend, there's a case before the Supreme Court next week about the ways that corporations, in the name of the religious freedom of the corporation itself or of the employer, think here Hobby Lobby, arts and crafts store, think here, the case next week is about Catholic Charitable Services in Wisconsin. Organizations are arguing that as religious organizations, they should be exempt from all sorts of laws when it comes to protecting employees on a number of fronts. So they should be basically exempt from employee protection laws. And the gig economy is another kind of manifestation of that, right? This is all absolving the company of responsibility for problems that then become totally individualized as on the individual employee or the individual worker's shoulders, rather than something that needs to be addressed through structural and political critique.
Yeah, I would just add briefly that among philosophers who are thinking about whether work is or should be central in human well-being, the rise of the gig economy has really thrown into doubt the centrality of work in human life. That's built partly around the idea that you have not only a work week in which you're spending a lot of time at work and then work becomes central, but also the centrality of work in life as a source of relationality and a sort of commitment that the worker might bring to work. I mean, it's built around an ongoing relationship that is positive and productive between employee and employer. And the gig economy really reduces that old ideal of a person having a full-time job to which they're committed. And in a social context in which there isn't a robust safety net or a universal basic income, the gig economy does seem to be rife for the probability of exhaustion and overwork and insecurity and poverty. So there is a lot that is worrisome in the growth of the gig economy, especially without the safety net in place. Now, if we had universal basic income, it is often thought that there would be nothing morally problematic in you taking a gig every now and then. You know, you can play a show, for instance, and have that gig, and that's just something that you do on top of your universal basic income. So you're not trying to scrape by merely through gaining money through your gigs. Then you're in a precarious position. But if the gig is in addition to your universal basic income, it is thought it's a sort of enrichment for life. So yes, the gig economy in the absence of the universal basic income is really ripe for exploitation.
Thank you so much for your talk today. My question is, I have been thinking a lot about these kinds of scenarios at work that involve some aspect of religious freedom or religious expression that seem to lead to situations in which there is no outcome that satisfies everybody, and there is no clear way forward where everybody is going to feel heard and feel comfortable with the resolution. I'm thinking about maybe a scenario in which there is a trans or non-binary individual in a workplace who wants to, utilize a specific name or certain pronouns, and maybe another person in that workplace who has a religious faith who says, in my perspective, I should not be required to use those pronouns because that's against my religious faith. And in that conflict, there's very unlikely to be a resolution in which everybody feels that they have been heard and that the outcome is acceptable to them. And it seems that these situations are maybe almost becoming more frequent and more kind of explosive in nature. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on ways that we can approach these situations and think through those situations when it feels like there is no outcome that is going to be appropriate.
It's a wonderful question, and the short answer is yes, that's right. Most of these situations are ones in which there is not a desirable outcome that will please and satisfy everyone. So a couple quick responses, I guess. First is it's why I think questions of process matter a lot, and it's why questions of kind of mindset matter a lot. I'm blanking on his name right now, but there's a wonderful legal scholar at Columbia who wrote a book a couple of years ago on the problematic way in which we think about rights in America. His argument basically was that we tend to think too few things as being rights, but then thinking that if something is a right, it's unassailable and absolute. And his argument is that we need to go kind of the opposite way and think of more things as being rights, but recognizing rights as always in tension with other rights and as flexible and negotiable, and that it's always a question of negotiating my rights versus your rights. If you look, this is a weird thing to recommend, but if you look at the compliance manual of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which sadly I've spent a lot of time with, it actually lays out a fairly remarkably solid process for thinking through these questions, which is that it presumes a process of negotiation and conciliation where people are going to have to bend and be flexible. And it does not presume an outcome where one party gets everything they want or that somebody is right or that's wrong. It presumes that an employee brings a concern to the employer, that an employer has to take that concern seriously, has to imagine creatively a variety of different kinds of possible ways of accommodating. The employee might not get exactly what they want. The employer has to take into account the needs of the business and of other employees. They have to go back and forth. It presumes the employee will be flexible and will be open to multiple different ways of resolving the situation. None of that is usually how it actually works out in practice. But that's partly a problem, as I've said, of how we think about rights in this country, that more and more over the last 20, there's a very complicated history in the last 20 years of how religious freedom has become what it is in this exact current political moment. But more and more people seem to think that religious freedom guarantees an absolute right to do whatever one wants in the name of religion. And the process that the law suggests is actually one that's much more of a process of good faith negotiation, where everyone's expected to be a little flexible and a little accommodating. So I don't want to be too Pollyannish about this, but I think there actually is a model built into the system that if we actually realize it a little bit more fully, could be useful. The courts are not recognizing that. When the Supreme Court decided 2 years ago a landmark Title VII case about religious accommodations, they ignored most of that. If you look at a few years ago now, the landmark case about the football coach who took a knee at the 50-yard line saying that he had a right to pray after games, that was a workplace case. He was an employee of the schools who was asserting a right to be accommodated, and he completely ignored the need, the process, the EEOC's process for working it out, and instead asserted that his right was absolute and unassailable. And the court said, yes, he's right. And I think the problem with that case was, in fact, that insistence on the absolute nature of the right in ways that we need to rethink.
Hi. I have a question about the retirement aspect that you brought up. Oh, sorry. Okay, so you brought up that people who have retired face different reactions to it. Like some people feel that they have lost a part of themselves and a part of their meaning to their life, or others are rejoicing. I was wondering do you think that has anything to do with the kind of starting majorly with the Industrial Revolution, this assertion that we are only meant to work and to be part of a productive part of a capitalist society, and do you think that that those reactions would go more towards a rejoicement after retirement, when, or not in a post-work society, but with the reduction of hours in the work week?
Yeah, I think that the possibility of flourishing in your retirement really brings to mind that flourishing requires activity of one sort or another. And of course, philosophers of my own bent are inclined to emphasize that work is a necessary part of flourishing. But even beyond work, there are a lot of activities that people can engage in that contribute to their flourishing. You mentioned volunteer work. There's also reading, discussing, being involved in the community, being physically active, being engaged with your family, caregiving in the home. All of this is activity of one sort or another. So the possibility that a person will thrive in work really highlights, I think, Aristotle's idea that flourishing is complex. It doesn't reduce to one single good, be it knowledge or health or citizenship in a well-ordered society or friendship or work or anything. But flourishing is broad and multifaceted. So in retiring, a person can flourish through different kinds of activity. But something that we might loosely call work may be a component of a flourishing retirement. In the book that I'm working on right now about awareness of suffering, I'm really arguing that we need more freedom from work in order to develop our minds and read more widely in order to become aware of problems of suffering around the globe. But I don't have in mind that somebody would retire and then read a book on modern slavery, but rather that retirement represents a sort of ideal for a person where you have time to engage in a plurality of activities that include your intellectual development and growth alongside other kinds of activities.
It seems like that requires a guarantee of material security, right, in retirement, right? But there has to be the benefit there to allow one to retire securely.
I'm not seeing anyone else at the microphone. I have another question that I kind of wanted to ask. You mentioned sort of getting more freedom from work. It raises for me just the question of vacation as a part of the structure of the way we think about work, and people need vacation. And in Europe, you get a lot more vacation than in the U.S. You get vacation for religious holidays too. And I'm wondering how,
They try not to call it vacation. They try to distinguish it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm curious how that fits into the equation of everything we've been talking about.
Yeah, I absolutely think that it would be a boon to human flourishing if we increase the number of what you might call vacation hours or non-working hours, discretionary time. Because as I was at pains to say, I mean, the fact that work is important for flourishing doesn't mean that we should maximize this good. Rather, work is really something to balance alongside other non-working activities. Human flourishing is really not some sort of maximalist conception of the good where there's one single thing that is good, such as money or pleasure or profit or power, that should be maximized. But rather, human flourishing is a sort of pluralistic conception of the human good that draws on many different components. So work is a part of your flourishing, but so is an ample period of non-working or vacation hours alongside other activities.
First, I would just agree, like, we need more time off from work. Yes, and whether that time is for religious reasons or others, absolutely. The same thing I would just add, I think this is a corollary, not a point of contention in any way. But I think, for example, about like Kathy Weeks's work, right, who's kind of an early anti-works, post-work theorist, the problem with work. And I think really important to Weeks's argument is that when she argues for the need for more time outside of work, it is not on her reading just for more time for leisure, but she's interested in what are the political possibilities that open up with more time outside of work, and how does more time out of work open up for different forms of political organizing, of forming political identities, of different kind of political collectivities, of recommitting ourselves to various forms of democratic practice. And she's really interested in the political possibilities that open up in making more time outside of work, rather than simply it being time for leisure.
Wonderful. Well, I'm just going to wrap up with, I have this post, I have the calendar with dad jokes on it, and you all know why basketball players can't go on vacation, right? It's traveling. So, anyway, we kind of reached our time here, and we have to balance work with play a little bit here, and I'm old enough to tell dad jokes now, so I really do feel like we've done some good work here. I hope that some of you have the same feeling I have. It's a bit energizing to actually work through and really think, and I think that's part of the work of what we do at the university. What's enriching is engaging in dialogue that really is unafraid to look carefully at some tense topics and places where we might have disagreement. Oftentimes leads to some of the kinds of resolution and a deeper understanding that I think we all need, particularly in this time in our world. So please join me in thanking our wonderful speakers for a great discussion and dialogue.